Welcome to Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Isaac, and I'm here on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation, where we are discussing articles and book reviews in our journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. Today, we begin our discussion of the December 2022 issue, and we begin with the lead article. The lead article is titled Taxonomic Theology, an interdisciplinary approach to a biblical and biological theology of naming. We're delighted to have the authors with us today, Beth Stovell and Matthew Morris. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.
All right. It's good to have you with us all the way from Calgary, Alberta. And Matthew, it's good to have you back. You're a repeat participant. You were here 2 years ago, but then you had 3 co-authors, and now you're down to 1. Next time you'll be down to 0, perhaps, but at least you've been here. It's good to see you again. And Beth, this is the first time here, so help us let the audience get to know a little bit better. So you're now up in Calgary, Alberta. Are you native Canadian, born and raised?
No, born in Italy, grew up until my 20s in the U.S., and then for the second half of my life, Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas. Yeah, so I'm a Texan, and then the second half of my life in Canada. So I've kind of spread it out around the world.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's trace that a little bit further. So if you grew up in Austin, did you get your education there? Where did you go to school?
My undergrad, I did at the University of Texas at Austin, and then moved to Canada for my master's degree and my PhD. So,
what was your undergraduate major?
I was an English classics major, but I started off biochem because I love biology so much, and so I did switch into the humanities, but I began with this deep love of science, which is part of why the moment Matthew started working at Ambrose, I was like, can we be friends?
Okay. All right. That's good. So tell me again where you did your graduate work.
I did my graduate work at Regent College, the seminary there. And then I did my PhD at McMaster.
At McManus. Okay. It's familiar places for many ASA members here. We've been there often. And where did you go after you got your degree?
My first job was in Miami. I taught at a Catholic university. And then after 3 years there, the job opening happened in Canada. That's where my husband and his family are from. And so we moved to Calgary. We've been here for almost 9 years. So.
Okay, that's great. Now, share with us a little bit, if you would, about your faith background. Did you grow up in a Christian home? Did you come to the faith later?
Yeah. So my dad was a pastor in non-denominational evangelical churches for a portion of my life, and then went from that to becoming an evangelist of sorts. And so I grew up very much within kind of that framework, and then moved into what I am now, which is the Vineyard denomination, which some of you may be familiar with, which is evangelical and charismatic. And so my husband and I are actually on the national team for Vineyard Canada. So
okay, very good. All right. So you've been continuing in the faith for quite a while. So how did you get into this particular avenue that led to writing this article? How did you hook up with Matthew?
Yes. So as I mentioned, long interest in the relationship between faith and science. And one of my coworkers, Arch Wong, saw that there was an opportunity for seminaries to get involved in the work of connecting faith into our seminary with a grant with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, particularly with the dialogue on science, religion, and ethics, DOSER. And so we applied for that grant, got that grant, and right away thought, we need to build more of a relationship with Matthew as part of that. So he became one of our science advisors. alongside scientists at the University of Lethbridge as well, bringing them into the work that we do. So Matthew was teaching in my classroom. I brought him in for 2 sessions, and that kind of opened up the door for these conversations.
Okay.
And I'm handed to Matthew if he wants to talk a little more about those conversations. But yeah.
Well, let's just take a little moment to get to know Matthew before we get to that particular question. Matthew, I know we talked to you briefly 2 years ago, but somehow I suspect not everyone here will remember that. So tell us about you. Where were you born and raised, and how did you get to Calgary?
I'm from Southern Ontario, so born and raised Canadian, a little town called Hagersville, just south of Hamilton. So I'm looking forward to the conference happening this July, because it'll take me back to my neck of the woods.
Excellent.
But my grandparents moved to Calgary when I was a kid, or just south of Calgary, Crow's Nest Pass area. And my particular Christian affiliation has a Bible college in Calgary. So I moved to Calgary to go to Bible college and get to see my grandparents more.
That sounds good. Where did you get your education?
So I did sort of the reverse of Beth. I started in theology. I went to Alberta Bible College and got a Bachelor of Religious Education. After that, I moved out to the East Coast and did a Bachelor of Science at Dalhousie in marine biology. And then I moved back to Calgary when the opportunity presented itself to do a Master's in Environmental Genomics at the University of Calgary, and then a PhD in Evolutionary Biology. Evolutionary
Biology. And that was where again, the PhD?
University of Calgary.
That was at the University of Calgary. Okay, great. So, all right. So how did you get to Ambrose?
Well, I was had about a year left in my PhD, and it's a little despairing about what I was going to do afterwards. Where was I going to go? I stayed in Calgary because I fell in love. I met my wife at church. We ended up, having 3 kids, and I did not want to uproot the family to go do a postdoc for little money in some obscure corner of Canada. So I just wasn't sure what on earth I was going to do. So I knew of Ambrose University. I didn't know much about them, but I knew they existed. I knew they had a biology program, and so I wrote them a letter saying, "Hey, I'm interested. I exist. I know a fair bit about evolutionary biology. I know a fair bit about the sort of tensions that exist between certain aspects of faith and certain aspects of biology, having, grown up a young earth creationist and now a PhD in evolutionary biology. So I could be sensitive to students who had those sorts of struggles. And I was just deeply interested and intrigued in helping Ambrose out on that front. So they responded 2 days later and called me in for a conversation. And then a year later, as I was writing my thesis, there was a job opening, and I secured the position. And
how long has that been?
6 years.
6 years. Okay, that's great. Okay, so Beth already explained how the two of you connect a little bit. Now, between the two of you, how did you come to write this article? What got you interested in the topic of taxonomy and its spiritual implications? Either one.
Well, I can start on that one.
Sure.
I fell in love with the Linnaean system of classification when I was a kid. I had these little animal cards, like a picture of an animal on the front and a description of the animals on the back. You get them in cereal boxes. I ended up with over 1,000 of these things. And they had little images that would help you sort of sort and characterize where they belonged. And it got me familiarizing myself a bit anyways with these weird Latin names, right? Like, Artiodactyla and cetacea and these things that no other kid was talking about. But started to realize there's a way of organizing the natural world. And I was just deeply impressed by that possibility. And so I just sort of fell in love with species lists and species identification. And to the point that, like, I've been writing now these little, here's for Beth, the Texas freshwater fishes, where they're grouped by their sort of Linnaean categories.
I was just going to ask, do you have species cards that you can trade, like with baseball cards?
Yeah, they're basically almost like Pokemon cards or something like this, right?
Yeah.
So I was just
find anybody to trade it with.
Yeah. That was the thing. I was the only one I knew who had those things. I still have them, actually. My kids take them out and sort them from time to time. And but yeah, just fell in love with this idea of categorizing and organizing the sort of seeming chaos of the natural world. That love hasn't left.
You're much too organized. Puts me to shame. Yeah, that's cool.
And
Beth?
I think when Matthew and I were talking about how we would bring Matthew into my classroom specifically was a Pentateuch Torah class. So, we were looking at Genesis, and we were going to be looking at beginning the class with Genesis, ending with Deuteronomy. And we were talking about, how could we help students feel welcomed into this conversation, but also really challenge them to think in new ways about the world around them. And so we did our first conversation in Genesis, which got us setting up some of the questions around thinking about naming at the start. And then we did our last class in Deuteronomy, and name theology is one of the big conversations in Deuteronomy. And so it actually became a really interesting conversation between the two of us around how do we think about naming. And so it initially started as a co-taught lecture with a question and answer time, that then we said, I think this might be an article. And so we kind of started working on that. We had the gift. I don't think COVID is a gift, but we got to actually have the grant for 2 years instead of 1, which meant we got to do the teaching of it twice. And so the experience of the first time going through it and then adding to it and developing it, and based on what the students had asked, really thinking in new ways. And I found that I think we both found a lot of synergy in the way that we think, even though we ask different questions in our disciplines, there was a lot of overlap that we were finding in our conversations, which was really exciting.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. So how did you pick PSCF as the place to publish your article, or was that arranged in advance? How did you connect? I should also ask, what is your connection with ASA? How did you two connect here?
Well, the PSCF, I guess, is my initial proposal, in part because I, as an undergraduate student who had lots of questions about my particular religious upbringing in a young Earth creationist household. Now I'm in the science classroom in Dalhousie, and I'm learning these other things. I'd stumbled upon an old stack of back issues of the PSCF at the Alberta Bible College Library. And so I'd been familiar with this organization that was engaging with these questions that I was really interested in. And I found some articles by Denny Lamoureux. And when I moved out to Dalhousie, that name was sort of in the back of my mind. And so I emailed him, and the guy called me up, and we had a conversation for something like 3 hours. And he encouraged me to join the ASA, that it was free for students.
That's
and so
great.
I've been a part ever since.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, glad to see that. Okay. And Beth, how about you?
I think to some degree, but Matthew had been doing work with the ASA with bringing in speakers, and I had encouraged and brought my students to come to those talks, and so I had a sense of this is an organization that does good work, that builds good relationships. And then when we started talking about where would we put this, we just started reading different journals to see, well, what's the best fit, and this one definitely for both of us felt like that fit.
Okay, well, that's great. And so now here we are. So let's get into the heart of the article and get into the technical aspects. Part of the expectation here is that a significant share of the audience will already have read the article in advance, and so familiar with it. And we've got an opportunity for questions. We've got a couple of questions that were submitted in advance, and we're going to start with that. So Vicki, if you could open up the microphones and allow people to unmute themselves. I just really want to ask all of you to keep your microphone muted so we don't get unintentional background noise, and only unmute when you're called on. And if you have a comment or a question, please click on the icon of reactions down below at the bottom of your screen, and then click on raise hand. And so I'll call on raise hands after we get the advanced ones in. So with that, let's get started. The first question was submitted by Andy Quick. Andy, I see you over there. So if you could unmute yourself, let's hear from you.
Hey, Yeah, I wanted to thank you, Matthew and Beth, for the article. That was an excellent article that you wrote. And I'll just kind of read. I do acknowledge that there are many examples of self-serving and other confusing naming practices for species, and I wholeheartedly agree that these should be eliminated from taxonomy. You state that there are no rules against such naming practices, and I'm wondering, is there anything being done by the ICZN in regards to adopting some basic rules for naming? Also, I had a comment, and that is that there is a particular practice in using names that I think is God-honoring, and that is to give recognition to the honest work of people, whether scientists or not, in collecting and studying new species. For example, I think of Mary Anning, who received little recognition in her lifetime. There was one person that did name a species, or a few species after Anning. That was Louis Agassiz, the Swiss-American naturalist. And also, finally, in 2015, Anning was recognized in the naming of a new species of ichthyosaur, Ichthyosaurus anningae. So that's my question and comment.
Okay, Matthew, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. So about the ICZN and the rules, they are very clear in their code that they do not arbitrate on issues of taxonomic validity. What is a species and what is not a species? They recognize people are always going to disagree on these things, and it's up to the scientists to sort of sort that out. The rules are specifically regarding how one names, so principles of priority, the grammar that one uses, these sorts of issues. Now, your question is quite timely. You may be aware of a ruling that happened as we were preparing the manuscript in 2021. The ICZN does make rulings on particular cases that are brought before them. This particular case involved herpetology, so the study of reptiles. There's a sort of amateur herpetologist in Australia by the name of Hoser, who had named something like 700 different taxa, both family, genus, and species of crocodile and snake and lizard and all sorts of things in a very short period of time, making him one of the most prolific herpetologists in the history of herpetology. Some of those names are pretty, what word should I use? They're gross, like they're just not easy to say. Often named after, loved ones, dogs that he's had in the past, these sorts of things. And he self-published them in his own journal that doesn't undergo a typical peer review process. Now, a lot of these creatures that he named already had names. So he was splitting up a single species into multiple species, saying that, oh, no, there isn't one species of this viper in Africa. There's 4 species of this viper in Africa, and here are their names. And the justifications were typically weak, not backed up by robust science. And so, of course, the International Herpetological Societies, they were outraged. This is sowing confusion. This is adding disorder into the world rather than giving us clarity about what these creatures are. And some of these are venomous animals. So there is always the fear, right, that if you get bit by a snake in Africa and you go to the hospital, and you've identified it as one species, but the hospital has adopted this new naming convention, they might not have the antivenom labeled with the species that you're saying it is, right? And so they might say, I'm sorry, we don't have this on hand, when in fact they do. So there were fears about genuine human health concerns. And now what he was doing was he was looking at, say, preprints of articles where there'd be genetic research conducted on a species, and you'd see, oh, there's these different populations, and there's some genetic distinction among these populations, and maybe here's a taxon where this one population doesn't really fit within the entire species name, and the paper would be about to come out, and he would just sort of dive in and give that thing a name, right? And so maybe he would get that out in his article, before the actual article was published. So we'd have principle of priority on this. So all sorts of like things that were happening here that got herpetologists quite upset. And it seemed like it was wasting their time. Like Brazil, for instance, adopted many of this guy's taxonomic categories. And so they had to spend all this time trying to correct the Brazilian naming conventions that actually there isn't scientific backing for these names, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Hoser appealed to the ICZN to ensure that his journals would be recognized as genuine journals and that his names would be recognized as available names. The counter proposals from the Herpetological Society, and there were lots, pages of names of scientists on this counter proposal, were to blacklist that journal and all the names in that journal, and to find, it was one name in particular that was the test case here, but to find that one name as unavailable. So the ICZN, this was like 2013 that they appealed or brought this to the ICZN. 2021, they finally made their ruling, and the ruling was that they weren't going to use their powers to make a ruling on this matter.
Oh, no.
They said it was obvious, and so they weren't going to do it. In part because the rules for journals don't require peer review. They don't require scientific scrutiny. Right? It just has to be published, in part because that's how, you go back 200 years, and they didn't have those sorts of peer review requirements for articles. And so, they want to make sure that they are as open as possible. So long as it is printed in multiple copies and available to people, then it's a totally valid publication. And because they don't make decisions on matters of taxonomy, that's up to the taxonomists. So their idea is that we'll just let the dust settle, right? We'll let the reptile researchers agree or disagree on whether they're going to use these names, and eventually the scientists will sort it out. It's not up to them to make those decisions. So it's very controversial, and there was not a unanimous vote on that matter. Now, maybe in newer editions of the code, they might put in a requirement. It seems like a pretty easy one. Just put in a requirement for peer-reviewed publications for anything coming after the year such and such, right? Anything after the year 2021, the names need to be in a peer-reviewed publication. But so far, that hasn't happened. And just to give you a sense as to how slow they are on these things, right? 1999, they made up their new code, and there was a proposal to sort of lose the requirement that the genus and the specific epithet need to agree in terms of gender. In part because, a species might get moved to a new genus, and that Latin name that it had doesn't agree with this new genus, and so now they have to sort of fix that name. And because scientists don't know Greek and Latin anymore, right? So they just wanted to get around that, and ultimately the commission decided no. They didn't even make that small little allowance that no, the gender needs to agree. Right. So they're just very, very unwilling, it seems, to make even small allowances or small changes. And this is a big, big change.
Interesting.
Is it okay if I address the second question?
Please do. Please do.
So something I appreciate about what you're bringing forward with that, Andy, is Mary Anning, because of her time, her location in history, she wasn't honored for the work that she was doing, simply because of the way society functioned at the time. And so we could say that in some cases, like potentially in Mary Anning's case, honoring her work could be an action of restoring something that would be consistent with honoring God. But I think we also have to raise the question that in some cases, we might look at the naming of something named after a person, and we might learn about a history of that person that could make their name being labeled on something problematic. And so both of those things kind of have to be weighed alongside each other, I think, in those conversations. Because I think we could say in some cases, this seems like it aligns with godly and biblically oriented ethics. And in other situations, it's like, well, but then we have these other kinds of factors we also have to balance in that conversation. So I think I appreciate you raising it, because I actually think it's a complex piece of some of what Matthew and I were talking about as we were working on this.
Okay. Now I see Bob and Janet, you've raised your hand. Is this related specifically to Andy's question and comment? If so, I'll take it now, but otherwise we'll wait till later. Yeah. Okay, that's very good. Thank you, Andy. And the second question submitted in advance was from Del Kuhn. Del?
No.
Okay.
Am I live? I hope.
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah. Thanks for the article. I appreciate it from both of your authors, and I'm really enjoying the inside taxonomy stories. But what I'm really looking for is maybe some insight from the two of you, because as you point out, a lot of how we understand the world is our creation of the world. It's not necessarily out there for us to, quote, discover. And some of our interpretations are going to be better than others, however we define better. Mendel's genetics is a better description than the doctrine of signatures, for example. So when you're noting that a lot of the decisions that you make in taxonomy are going to have social and/or political consequences, say in areas restricted for an endangered species or a pipeline will or won't go through a particular area, how do you approach decisions like that? It's not pure science, but there's other agendas, a lot more, or a lot of different things at stake than just getting the right Latin and Greek names and classifications. So thoughts from both of you on that?
Yeah, one of the things you asked in the kind of the email question was really what makes one interpretation better than another. And I think even to your question, within biblical studies, one of the things we're always doing is we have a whole lot of different kinds of data that we're weighing at all times to decide what's a better way of approaching this question. Some of those are everything from, what is linguistic data or historical data, but some of it's also questions of ethics and consistency with theology. And so even as we're thinking about these questions, one of the questions really has to do with what best takes into consideration as many of the factors as we can and tries to balance those factors in a way that honors God and honors the work that we're doing. And that's just a really general statement, but I think it's true of disciplinary work that we do. And so I'd love to, pass it to Matthew around the taxonomy piece specifically, but I feel that that's a piece of what it means to do good biblical interpretation that then can lead to good, responses on a scientific side.
Yeah, and I would just say, maybe I'm a semi-realist. There are fuzzy boundaries around species that mean there are different, we can come to different conclusions looking at the same sorts of populations of how many species actually exist here. And we, in a sense, construct nature as we come to learn about these differences and what we construct it to our minds, right? Which affects our behaviors. It affects what we deem valuable. It doesn't change what's actually out there. It just changes how we observe what's out there, how we interact with what's out there. So to your question about pipelines and these sorts of things, and when you have fuzzy boundaries, what do you do with this? Because you could have somebody say, hey, this lake has a unique species of fish that's found nowhere else in the world. And somebody else says, well, actually, it's just a population of another species that's quite broad in distribution. And so maybe we could do some work around that lake that's going to affect it. And this is where different countries have different legislations around these sorts of things. Canada and the United States use somewhat different terms, but the idea is the evolutionarily significant unit or designatable unit, which tries to get around the fact that species have these kind of fuzzy boundaries, at least in certain cases. So you can say this thing of fish in this lake, we're not sure if it belongs to this one species or not. Some people say yes, some people say no, but there is something weird about it. It's genetically different from other populations, or it is morphologically distinct, or it has these unique roles in its ecosystem that we don't find in other locations. And so because it is significant in that sense, it can be protected. You can enact legislation to protect something like that without needing to worry about whether it belongs to a species that's widespread or is its own little distinct thing. Right, so that's one way that we've, biologists and legislators have been trying to work together to get around the fact that evolution is complicated and taxonomy is complicated, and no two taxonomists will agree, but you still need to move ahead and make decisions about things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Thank you very much. So, okay, those of you who raised your hands, anybody wants to make a comment or question, please raise your hand, and we'll start with Bob. Unmute yourself and we'll hear you. Okay.
There we go. Thanks, Randy. And thank you very much for the paper. And I also want to take a quick opportunity to thank Matthew for his great work with the Calgary chapter of the ASA, CSCA. He's the prime leadership there and has had some good meetings, and it's very much appreciated. Now, for the two of you, in your paper towards the end, under taxonomic theology for the church, your point number 3, I just wanted you to sort of flesh it out a little bit. Evangelicals are underrepresented in the sciences. Taxonomic theology suggests that barriers placed on Christian students entering biology need to be removed. And then it just goes on a little bit. It's sort of a two-pointed question. Have you got any tricks or hints as to how that might be done? And are the boundaries on both sides of this science and faith issues for Christian students?
Beth, do you want
to start with that one?
Oh, sure, I can start with that one. Yeah, I mean, my own background, again, I went to Bible college before I went to Dalhousie. And so I thank God that I did that first, because had I gone straight into my undergrad and encountered my cell and bio prof second year to an audience of probably 400 some students, ended a lecture by saying, well, you can believe what I'm telling you today, or you can believe that God did it. Like, that was this sort of parting shot. And that could have been really devastating to me had I not gone to Bible college first and sort of engaged in worldview thinking and hermeneutics and all these sorts of things. So I was like equipped with a strong faith going in, and something like that couldn't shake me up as much as it might have. But I've seen students where they're really shaken by things that their high school biology teachers said, or by things that nobody said, by keeping church in one corner and science in the other. They'll go to their Christian school and they take a science class and they just learn science and they never engage, and then they take the religion and they never engage, and the two are completely split, and they come to Ambrose having no idea how to think about these things. So I've seen students who've had family members tell them, like, why are you getting into biology? That is not mission work. That is not for the church, right? And part of what taxonomic theology tells us is that, well, no, biology can very much be mission work. One of the very first things we see in the Bible is Adam naming the animals as part of his priestly responsibility over creation. And so those students going into ecology need to know that ecology is, in fact, good missional work. And there's often a confusion, I think, that somehow working in ecology or taxonomy, biology, zoology, whatever terms you want to use, that's somehow different from helping people. But when we see Genesis 1, we're made from the dirt, as are the animals. We're united in substance. The things that hurt the earth, they hurt us. And they hurt our neighbors. And so there can be good social justice work, good kingdom building work that happens in doing ecology or environmental science or these sorts of things. So, I mean, as to the solution, you are right that some secular universities or certain professors, it's at the very least certain professors in the classroom, can raise barriers that will kick students out of that room if they haven't been sort of pre-adapted to that possibility in the first place. They need churches, I think, churches and parents encouraging them and telling them that this is good work. Ignore what your professor might say on the matter. Here is why this is good work. Here is why this is what the church should be doing. I don't know, Beth, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Actually, I was just going to say, that segues really nicely into what I was going to say, which is the whole reason that we did a Science for Seminaries grant was to talk to specifically the pastors of churches and the leaders of churches and say, the way that you framed this conflict between science and faith isn't the only way to understand what the relationship is between science and faith. And actually, that from a pastor to their congregants is also a really important piece. So on the one hand, we're looking, these questions are, how do we talk to students to give them the space to say, yes, biology is a direction I could take. But on the other hand, we're also working with the pastors themselves. The people I train often have been pastoring for 20, 30 years. Some of them have only been told that there's only one way to understand how faith relates to science or doesn't. And so being able to talk to them has also been helpful to say, actually, I would love for every pastor in this room to make space for the scientists in your congregation, and to encourage those who might be interested in that as a calling from God. And so I think that was a part of why I wanted to have our students actually see this in the classroom, because I think that's another part of how we change that within the church.
Yeah, one of the things I loved about being in that Pentateuch class with the seminary students was introducing them to citizen science initiatives that involve naming and species identification. So there's a wonderful app called iNaturalist, where you can take a picture of a creature, and if your phone has those capabilities, it automatically tags the GPS, it gets uploaded. The algorithm looks at species that have been documented in your area that look kind of like what you just photographed, and will make proposals as to what the species might be. You can put in your best guess, and then experts will come in and validate or propose other names until you get enough agreement that it becomes research grade. And then it's used by researchers to answer all sorts of interesting questions, like, how are migration patterns of birds changing, or what bugs are active in the month of January in Calgary, and how is that changing over the years, right? All sorts of possibilities with this app. So could you imagine churches around Earth Day every year going out and doing a citizen science species documentation, right? What lives in their area? What are they responsible for getting to know? Naming is not just taxonomy. It's not just, that one researcher huddled over that fly for 10 years trying to figure out all the little bits and pieces of it. It's also us citizens getting to learn the names of the things that live around us in an effort to become responsible caregivers for those things.
That's great.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to, one quick personal question for Matthew, and looking at your research background. By any chance, are you a fly fisherman?
No, actually. So,
okay.
Funny story, I guess, is that I got into fish without ever having really fished. I fished twice when I was a kid. My parents were not into it. I thought fish were just the most boring creatures on the planet. And then I took a class with Jeff Hutchings at Dalhousie on the ecology and evolution of fishes. Jeff was one of Canada's foremost fisheries researchers. He worked for the government of Canada, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. He was a whistleblower when he realized that the science did not agree with the fishing regulations for the Atlantic cod. So he was a whistleblower that resulted in the closure of the Atlantic cod fishery. And so I got to take a class, and I just mentioned him because he passed away in January of last year, and it was a huge loss to Canadian biology, and a huge advocate. He was a huge advocate for the fish, working with the government and the public to ensure that Canadians took responsibility for these creatures that lived around us, and it didn't just go solely to corporations. So anyways, he had me just fall in love with fish as these creatures with diverse parenting styles and behaviors and communication abilities and weird morphologies. And I got to work in a salmon lab with him for a time. And that just completely changed my life direction. So I focus more on small fish. I use minnow traps largely for my work. Although we did do some ice fishing this year for the first time with my kids, and we caught some trout, and that was really
cool.
Nice.
Yeah. Now, could somebody put a link in the chat to that app that Matthew mentioned, and the rest of us can access it a little bit more. So, okay, that's great. So, Janet, it's good to see you with us here.
Nice to be here, and nice to see you again, Beth. We were at MacDiv together.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah, greatly appreciated your article. I love the mutually informative approach. And in line with what you were just saying, Matthew, science can be fun. I loved all the amusing anecdotes. I mean, maybe they weren't meant to be amusing, but it was quite funny. So a couple of comments, questions. First, I was thinking of speech act theory and just wondered if you would make any relationship to that. And secondly, I was also thinking about comparison with human animals and naming, and I'm thinking of all the genealogies, the importance of name in the Bible, and this tying to identity, thinking of we pray in Jesus' name, not as a magical formula, but because it says who he is, etc. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love actually for you to say what connection you're thinking about with speech act theory, because I'm happy to draw on that further. But it sounds to me like you have a way you're thinking about what that means.
Yeah, and I suppose there can be different angles to it, but I was thinking in terms of how speech, or in this instance, naming something brings something into being. And you were sort of hinting at that in your article. I mean, the classic one, for those not familiar, is a marriage ceremony. So just by the words, I do, I pronounce, mere words bring something into being that wasn't there. So creative acts similar to, of course, Genesis 1, etc.
Absolutely. So my work in research is around metaphor and how, in a sense, language helps us to conceive and understand the world. And so interesting, speech act theory kind of sits alongside that in some of the linguistic work that I do. But one of the things I think is interesting is this idea that there is a sense in which in Genesis 2, we see God giving Adam the opportunity to name things, and whatever they are named, that is how they are identified, is the language that's used. But there's also this interesting, to the second point you made, an interplay between the living creatures and how they are compared to the living creatures that are animal life and the living creatures that are human beings. And there seems to be an intentional interplay between these two creatures with nefesh, with life in them, and what happens with them. So both have the breath of life in them. Both are connected in a sense to the ground, and there's a sense of mutual care between them. So I think it's interesting how the language we see, it sometimes gets a little obscured in the English, but in the Hebrew, there's a lot of drawing connection between human life and the rest of natural life. Also, I think it is interesting as we think about the power of name. And so throughout Scripture, we get this idea of the power of naming. In the Old Testament, we have that in passages like Deuteronomy, which is part of the reason we brought Matthew in that session, where the name of God actually functions as God's activity in the world. And so the name of God even goes out to fight, interestingly enough, in the book of Deuteronomy, as the presence of God in the world. And so naming has a really important power in the world, in the Old Testament and throughout that picture. And the idea of someone bearing the name of God is deeply connected to the idea of the stamp of God upon that person and being identified with God. And so when we talk about the name of the Lord, which is sometimes pictured as something like a mighty tower or a fortress, as we describe it, we bring our understanding into a new way. Like we can see God's name and its purpose, and then we are named, and how we are named also identifies who we are. We can think of this in examples like Jacob, who in his name is depicted as someone who grabs a heel. And that is a part of how we understand who he is in his story through his naming. And so I think there's more to be said than what we said in the article. We kind of stayed focused specifically on the naming of animals, but I actually think that there is like lots that you could say about that relationship between the naming of human beings, the naming of animals, the naming of God, and how that plays out throughout Scripture, and potential implications for what that could mean around other scientific questions.
And I will say that.
What about differences? Oh, sorry, Matthew.
Oh, I was just going to say, it does point out a difference potentially between biblical naming practices and taxonomic, where the semantic content of the name does not matter in taxonomy. Mm-hmm. The meaning doesn't matter. It's just a reference point to something. And I do have to say, sorry, Janet, that I know we talked about speech act theory at the conference, and I came back with that and said, hey, Janet has this cool idea. And for the life of me, I couldn't remember what it was called. So thank you for bringing that back up again. But sorry, you had a follow-up.
Yeah. Did you have more, Janet?
No, thanks.
Okay. I'd like to follow up a little bit on that before we go to Oscar and Robert. I noticed throughout the Bible, there is a repeated reference of the type of calling upon the name of the Lord. And often you'll see the two phrases, calling on the Lord and calling on the name of the Lord. In fact, in Psalms, you'll see the two phrases together. Is there any distinction there? Is there any significance to calling on the name of the Lord versus calling on the Lord? Or is that just two different ways of saying exactly the same thing?
So, I mean, there's theological arguments about how naming and the use of the idea of God's name becomes an extension of who God is. And we see these different ways that God is personified throughout Scripture, not just in the name of the Lord, but things like the wisdom of the Lord, which in Proverbs we see Lady Wisdom as an extension of who God is. So the difference has to do with when we extend some aspect of who God is, and that aspect is what moves forward. With naming, the idea that that in the ancient world, you would have a name on a monument as a way of saying, this space is mine. And you would have names put onto things like idols and things like that to designate them as belonging to or referencing that God. And so what we see in Scripture is a lot of this interesting space where praise goes to the name of the Lord, and the name of the Lord is praised and also connected to those who praise the Lord. So, so there's a sense in which it's connected to the remembering that's throughout, that's specific. That's a huge theme throughout the Old Testament, and it is also connected to the idea that that there's a fascinating dynamic of whether or not Yahweh gets named or not. When he is asked, when Moses asks for his name, how he responds is something that is both a name and not a name. And so there's an interesting space of this connection between that God is named and we honor that name, and God also refused to be fully named. And so the name is actually really important, whether it has that in there or not. While on the one hand, you could say they're equal, because God's name is a part of who God is metonymically. You could say, okay, well, yes, both are speaking about praising the Lord. But when you add the name of the Lord, you're emphasizing a particular aspect. It is this Lord and not some other Lord. It is, and so I think that's a piece of what we've got going on. And also that, I guess I said, that kind of theme of remembering that the Lord is doing that process. So,
okay, all right, thank you. Okay, let's go to Oscar. Unmute yourself. That's good.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Beth. Matthew, an excellent article. I like it a lot. And something that we all agree is that taxonomists have a lot of work to do in naming a species. There is a lot of the biodiversity that is there, and the place where taxonomists, I think, have more work to do is in the tropics. I am from Peru, a tropical country, and I have been working with taxonomists. I'm an ecologist, avian ecologist, and I have seen that due to the scarcity of taxonomists, usually taxonomists go to help get the help of local people known as para-taxonomists. And there could be a lot of these para-taxonomists around that they are usually people that even don't have any scientific training. And one of them that was a very good friend of mine was a pastor, a missionary. He's well known in some areas and knows about tropical mammalogy or ornithology. Is Peter Hawking. He recently passed away last year. 20 years ago, I went with him, and we were looking for specific sort of parrot that he thought it was a new species. And with the help of the church there in that remote village in the mountain forest of Peru, we were able to locate and collect this parrot. And in 2005, it was published as a new species, and they give him they gave this parrot his name, Aratinga hokingi. But later, the committee that deals with taxonomic review of the name of the birds, they rejected that proposal because there's not enough genetic evidence of this species or so. Well, then I found out that geneticists and morphologists sometimes don't get along. They have to be some sort of interaction or so, that I'm not sure how that works. But also something else that I really found out was when I befriended this pastor that later was a good friend, that he was really passionate about going out and look for new species and name new species. And he was later recognized after he died even by the Natural Museum of Natural History in Peru as a very good friend of the museum that have collaborated with a lot of specimens. But something that also was a characteristic was that he was not taken too seriously because he was an outspoken young earth creationist. My point is, what it's possible to do in your view, both of you, how to involve this parataxonomist that could be in the church? That they could be young earth creationists or not. How is possible to get them interested in helping scientists in this way?
Matthew, do you want to take that initially?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the story. If you don't mind typing his name into the chat there so that I can look him up afterwards. And of course, it's not the final. I'm sure it's not the final word on that parrot. Now that the name's out there, the name is a genuine name that is associated with the type specimen for all time. If it's a junior synonym, it's a junior synonym. But it could always get elevated back up to the level of valid species again as more genetic work comes out. This is the thing with genetic work: like how many loci does one look at? That can affect your results. You do mitochondrial or nuclear work that can affect those results. Are you looking at both morphology and genetics? All those things can say there's sort of creative interpretation that has to go on as you look at different levels of data. But as to your question about engagement, and you made the point at the beginning that there's a lack of trained taxonomists, and just how stunningly true that is. Universities have been closing their zoology departments. They've been getting rid of their collections. There's been such an emphasis on genetics. And now we're starting to realize that, actually, that other stuff was really important, especially as species are moving around the globe or we're threatened with biodiversity loss. So we're looking at, things that might contribute new medicines. Taxonomy is really necessary, but the people with those skills and that training and that love are, essentially dying away, right? So could you imagine if the church, again, was taught about Adam's naming of the animals as something theologically significant, not just Adam looking for a wife? And I don't know if you guys read that book review about animals and this person who talked about like Adam had sex with all the animals. That this was in the PSCF, and there's a book review that this guy was saying that's what the naming was, that he was just like boggles the mind interpretations that people have had about Adam's naming of the animals and how they've devalued just the act of naming the animals alone, what that actually means from a God who names the world into being, and then Adam names the animals. There's something important there, right? And so if the church recognized taxonomy itself as a valid discipline, could we not, start raising up a new generation of Christian taxonomists? And taxonomy, although there is systematics, which involves evolutionary theory and trying to name things according to evolutionary theory, and sort of get things in their evolutionary relationships. it's not necessary for delineating one species from another. And there's all sorts of examples where you could never understand the evolutionary underpinnings of something, like, or maybe just have sort of rudimentary, like the Ediacaran fauna. All those things need names, but we don't know how a lot of those creatures fit into the evolutionary scheme of things. So whether you're an old Earth or young Earth creationist or an evolutionary creationist, you can still engage in the act of taxonomy. In that sense, it's sort of free of those presuppositions. So I think I had a couple things mixed up in there, but just if you can imagine the church engaging in taxonomy and inspiring a new generation of taxonomists, that's what I'd like to see.
It's great. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, Randy. I was just going to say, I was thinking about ways that we might inspire the church to be excited to have these conversations. A recent book that I was reading, Nature Strange and Beautiful, is located in that space of the tropics, and showing the beauty of the earth that we're in. And I really think that there's space for that as a part of how we build this, not just making people come into biology itself, but really being excited about the world around them. And so anyways, Randy, it seemed like you might want to move on. So I just wanted to mention that.
Okay, that's good. Thank you. All right, let's go on to Robert. Good to see you again. Oh, well, not see you, but see your name.
Well,
there we go.
Maybe now you can see me.
Yes, now we can.
Hi, thanks. So a very interesting discussion and a very positive article, positive talk. But there is one thing in the article that stuck out, maybe not as positive, but I mean, it's going on all the time these days, where you say that it's likely there'll be resistance to altering time-honored scientific names that have colonialist overtones. I mean, as you know, this is going on all over the place in Canada right now, as the first prime minister's name is being erased from schools, and Toronto Metropolitan University was once upon a time Ryerson University. So I'm wondering what's going on in the taxonomic field in this regard. How much is this an issue or a problem there? And to what would you regard as an appropriate Christian response to all of this, to the extent it is going on?
Thank you for the question, because Beth and I just submitted an abstract to the next ASA conference about that very thing, and it's what we're going to be spending the next few months thinking about, because she's going to help me think sort of biblically and ethically about these concerns. But I can just say taxonomically that there is a difference between renaming a school, renaming a mountain, or renaming a species. It's relatively easy to rebrand the vernacular name or common name of a species, which we saw recently. What was formerly known as the gypsy moth here in Canada has been renamed. McCown's longspur here in Alberta has been renamed. But those are the common names. Changing the scientific names are more challenging, in part because of the principle of priority. There are no rules that would permit a name to just be changed willy-nilly. It's in part because what they're trying to seek is standardization and stability of species names, in part for conservation purposes. Legislation is often slow to change, and it uses species names as the thing being protected. And if the species name in the scientific world changes, but the old name is what's protected, you can result in a loss of protection for the thing whose name has just changed. And so there's actually cases where the ICZN refuses to change a name under the principle of priority. They found actually, it should be called this thing, but we're still calling it this thing, because changing the name would disrupt conservation. So in this case, the resistance seems to be more about maintaining the status quo with these names in order to maintain protection for creatures. But Beth and I are going to think more about that. So that's what does happen with the ICZN. But what should happen is a different question. And what are sort of creative or imaginative solutions that one could envision in the code that would permit for these sorts of changes? I know, Beth, is there something you want to say about this?
I mean, So besides my work with Ambrose University, I work on truth and reconciliation work with Indigenous peoples in Canada. That's part of my work. And I see that flowing out of my beliefs as a Christian around care for my neighbor. A really basic principle of what we see Jesus saying is, the 2 commandments: love God, love your neighbor. And so, some of the conversations around some of this comes out of questions, both from Christians and from, non-Christians, around, what is ethical naming? And it's a really complicated question because it builds into some of our big questions about how do we understand ourselves, whether in the US or Canada or wherever you are. How do you see yourself as a national entity? How do we honor the people who are part of that story? But then also, how do we see the history of our places that we've lived and the problematic histories of that in terms of hurting people? And so that plays into some of the questions of how we see Scripture's response to that in terms of, some of the questions that go along with that. So I think we'll have more. Matthew and I will definitely be having more of those conversations for a while. It's not cut and dry what the right answer is, but I think we'll be working on what are the nuances of that are most helpful as we try to give those suggestions or to think through them.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you. I mean, what comes to my mind is, if this really is a problem, let's just not name anything after any human ever again. I mean, at least everybody would be treated equally, and all the ethical issues, like some generation 100 years from now will decide someone else had unethical behavior. So really, it does come to my mind, let's just never name anything after anybody ever.
Well, it plays off of Andy's first question. But it plays off of Andy's first question. What do we do in situations where someone has not been recognized for the work that they've done? Are there times when naming is restorative? And so, it is a complicated question. So
I agree, but I mean, it really, anyway, that's just something to think about.
I will add.
I'm very anthropocentric, but I guess this is anti-anthropocentric, I suppose. Anyway, thank you very much.
I'll add to that too. That I mean, there's also species being named after companies that have won the rights to naming, which is its own sort of concern, or species named after people not as an honorific but as an insult. You have this ugly, disgusting looking beetle, so let's name it after your ex-wife or something like this. So there's other concerns as well. But at the ASA conference last summer, we had a father-son taxonomy duo who they do taxonomy in, I think it was like the freshwater mussels and other sorts of mollusks. And they came to the talk and they had this really interesting comment about restorative hope for naming, which was not just using Latin or Greek, but using local indigenous words in the names for species. And one of the things they mentioned is that there are cases of, I think it was, if I'm going to get this wrong, I'm not even going to say where it was, but there was a case of a species that was going to be named using an indigenous phrase. And then it turned out that same name, which was great for one indigenous group, was deeply insulting for another indigenous group. And that's not without using eponyms, without using people's names, right? So just getting rid of human names doesn't necessarily solve the problem, especially as language changes. Other terms can become problematic that weren't problematic before.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Ralph, good to see you with us here. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. You need to unmute, Ralph. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself.
Does that work?
Much better.
Okay, so I'll try to retrace my steps. First of all, so this is not my main question, but I first wanted to compliment you guys on the article. I will probably use it as a class handout in my fossils class. But and then the first point is not really the main point I wanted to talk about, but just back to your point about naming. Here's an example that doesn't involve people. So people's names attached to species nomenclature is an old and honorable tradition. There's no reason to ditch that at all. But here's an example of a non-person's name. There's the largest minnow in North America, as Matthew knows, is the pike minnow. And there are 4 species, Colorado and so forth, Sacramento River, Columbia River. The pike minnow used to be known as the squawfish. So Colorado squawfish, Sacramento River squawfish, Columbia River squawfish, and so forth. The ichthyological community decided that was derogatory, and they did away with that name many, many years ago. So
the government of Alberta was still using that in their government reports as late as 2014.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So I learned it way back when, and of course, in the 1980s, you didn't think twice about that, right? But at any rate, so yes, there are remedies for this sort of thing. But on the other hand, there is a case to be made for the stability of common names, because these are the names that millions of people use, for naming taxa. And you actually want those to be stable. And then the scientists can actually dicker in the background about what the actual Linnaean classification or whatever classificatory system you want to use. We can resolve that with some argument in the backdrop, and then maybe hopefully resolve for generations the main issues. In the meantime, you've got stable names for creatures. So that's very important to have that. But my main question to the authors was, you have this wonderful section on disagreements on species boundaries, and you talked a little bit about that already, sort of the fuzziness of species boundaries. And like you, I tend to be a realist. In fact, what I want to be is a hardcore realist. I want to be as hardcore as I can. I want to think that species are real, and I think angels are real, and on and on and on. Ethical principles are real. And that's based on, as a scientist, it's based on my apprehension of what the world's all about. And as a Christian, that's based on my apprehension about what God is all about. So the two dovetail. So I'm a pretty hardcore realist. And yet, everybody that works with species understands their boundaries are fuzzy, and especially if you extend it back into the fossil record. So I have named fossil species. I've also delved into the naming of modern species. And at some level, just about everything is interconnected. So as an example, if you look at bison in North America, bison came in near the end of the last ice age as this big, humongous boreal bison species. And then that began to sort of shrink in size. It became something that we call bison antiquus. Somewhere along the line, another very dramatic species of bison emerged in North America. That's the longhorn bison, Bison planifrons. And then over time, Bison antiquus, basically you can show by measurement of horn cores, the thing gradually shrinking to the dimensions of the present day bison. So somewhere along the line, the taxonomist is forced to split Bison antiquus from the modern day bison. Yeah, Bison priscus, that's what I was searching for. That's this big boreal bison that comes in from Eurasia at the end of the start of the last phase of the ice age, the Wisconsin phase. So it comes in at any rate, and then undergoes all this other stuff. But you can clearly show this gradual shrinking of the size of bison, and somewhere along the line, you stop calling it Bison antiquus, and you start calling it bison. So taxonomists, especially if you engage the time dimension, you begin to realize boundaries are fuzzy. And in the meantime, we have the Linnaean system, which is based on a realistic view of what taxa are all about, and it actually goes back. It's a modified version of an Aristotelian scheme. And so how does a realist like me look at bison or a fish species, Oncorhynchus? I love to see the Oncorhynchus nurka appear in your article. It was beautiful, just absolutely beautiful. Best eating fish in the world, for one. But at any rate, how does a scientist think of taxonomist think about the reality of taxa in a God-given creation, and the fact that genealogy is an important factor in God's way of constructing humanity? We think about the genealogy of Abraham, the very genealogy of Christ. Genealogies evidently are important to God, and they were obviously of use in constructing the way the living world is based. So how does genealogy work into a realistic view of what taxa are? For me, that's an important question, one that I hope you'll be writing a lot about, but I think it's a significant question.
Yeah, that is.
Matthew?
Thank you very much for that.
Yeah.
Beth, do you want me to start on this one? And
I just had one side.
I want all your wisdom. Yeah.
I'll add one side thing that I think could be helpful, and then I'm happy to hand it over to you for building it into perhaps more into the science. And just something that I think is really interesting about what you've brought up is that even in biblical studies, we take an approach across time to think about how we see development, how we understand even the revealing of God. And so to me, there's something really interesting, the importance of genealogies and the importance of knowledge across time is a biblical principle that's even built into the process of the Bible becoming the Bible we have today.
Yes.
And so I think that there's even a canonical logic that is even built into your question that I think is really appropriate. And now I'm going to pass it over for what that means for taxonomy to Matthew. But I feel like I wanted to raise that it's not just consistent with genealogies themselves, but with the nature of Scripture.
Yeah, well, when you have a time component and sort of slow, gradual changes, you're going to have the same sort of naming problems that we have with anything. We're trying to pin a name down to something that does. This came up in the article in September on gender dysphoria, right? What names do we give when there are fuzzy boundaries? And when you name something, what does that exclude? What does it include, but maybe it shouldn't include? And all these sorts of issues, right? It's not. We find this in all sorts of different areas. Or the article in this particular issue about death, and when is someone actually dead? That has real implications. So when I think about something like Oncorhynchus nerca, the sockeye, we have something sort of analogous, this Racine model of evolution, where you have an ancestral stock that's still persisting into modern times, unlike your bison example where it's gone. It's persisting into modern times, but it's shooting off little kokanee populations in all these different lakes. So from an evolutionary perspective, these sockeye or these kokanee are ecologically distinct from the sockeye. They are genetically distinct. They are morphologically some sort of distinct. They re-evolve sort of sockeye features as they live in, like the bright red coloration of their flesh, for instance. You would think each independent kokanee population should receive its own species name under a phylogenetic species concept or something along these lines, but obvious hesitation to do that when they're all so similar. The kokanee seems to be one sort of thing. So the solution here, with at least the one that I appeal to maintain some degree of realism, is to define the species concept that you're using. So to talk about kokanee, really, I'm using something akin to a morphological and or an eco-species concept. So it would be a morphospecies or an eco-species as opposed to a phylospecies. That hasn't gained a ton of acceptance outside of, say, the philosophy of biology. It's not, I don't see a lot of practicing biologists using it. But I think it's a way of being clear about what you're talking about, in a way that accepts some sort of reality. So when you talk about your bison, you got those two distinct species. You're not using the biological species concept because you don't know if those things could mate or not. If you took an ancestor and brought it out with the modern form, Very well, they could reproduce. You're using a morphological species concept or something along those lines, right?
One hears the term chronospecies.
Chronospecies, sure, yeah, in a time sequence, right? Yeah, yes. Of course. Yeah. So I don't know, does that solve anything for you, or does that just open up a whole nother can of worms?
It'd be nice to be God and understand how this works. That's not going to happen.
Okay.
So,
okay.
I thank you very much.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. We got a little time left, John. Let's hear from you.
Thank you, Randy. Thanks, Ralph. That's an excellent observation you've made here, and introducing time. And Beth, your response, and Matthew, yours are really helpful on this, because I suspect the problem is with us and how we use the language. So I'm gonna refer to Princess Bride. If you've seen that movie, right at the beginning, they get the one of the characters there, one of the bad guys, is saying "inconceivable," and he uses that, and Inigo Montoya turns around and says to him, "I don't think that word means what you think it means." And that's a really powerful concept, because we use language, time, species, the Bible. Beth, you said the Bible. I said, I wonder what Bible she's talking about. King James, Vulgate, the Jerusalem translation, which language, and what point in time do you say Bible? And we say Bible as if we know what we're talking about. And so I pick up the Phillips edition, or I pick up the Living Bible, and my pastor says, the Living Bible's not so good. You should actually be using this. and this is a huge problem of communicating. And I think it actually speaks closely to the reality of the creation and what God is actually doing. It's deeply, deeply relational. And this is a fascinating conversation, because Ralph looks at species over paleontological time. Matthew's looking at the problem in fishes. I'm an insect ecologist and evolutionary biologist, and I had to deal with this, trying to figure out how to deal with what I saw in a group of species that we just chose not to try and rename. In other words, we just kind of ignored the taxonomic problem, but recognized the reality. And I guess we would call them sort of, I've forgotten the term we landed on, but it's an ecospecies. Ecologically, these things are functioning in different ways. They're distinct populations. In fact, folks, I could hold these two species up to you. They have the same taxonomic name. I could hold them up to you, and you would say, that's one and that's another. They're morphologically, they actually look quite different in the larva. But in the adult males, on which the taxonomic name is based, you can't see a difference. We've stared at them until we were nearly blind and realized. So now do you go to genetics, or do you go to chemical ecology? Because that's the way I found is that they have pheromones, and they respond to different pheromones. And so they're quite distinct, but do we actually need to name those? And so it gets back to what's the purpose? Why are you naming a thing? So I like the direction, Matthew, that you've been taking us, is that you get down to what is the purpose on this thing. And I'll end this little observation by saying that over the years, the challenge is that I see particularly with students coming into the class, and we run into it in the church, is that people have a kind of Greek, I guess, notion of what a species is. And they think that they come in binaries, that people come in simple binaries. There's males and females. And I said, well, yes, there are, except that about 2 out of 100, the doctor holds up the baby and says, it's not a boy or girl, it's a baby, because we just don't even know. And so we have that problem with humans. We have that problem with every organism. And that's part of the way the world is created. And our challenge here, Beth, goes back to a theological challenge, is that we've We have a kind of simple hermeneutic that's abroad that says things come in simple binaries. And if they don't, the world is the problem. The world is fallen. The world is faulty. And I think that hermeneutic has to underlie some of this conversation out there. And then finally, I'll say, Ralph, you introduced something interesting when you put genealogy out there. And I think Josh Swamidass did something good for us to separate out genetics and genealogy and to get us to think about what happens over time. And that's a huge conversation that continues to go on. But this is a very fruitful and helpful direction that things are headed.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes. Any comments, Matthew or Beth?
Yeah, I wanted to talk for just a second about the question of binaries in Scripture. So what is interesting in Scripture is that actually, culturally, there wasn't simple binaries in Scripture. While there is a really basic structure of male and female, obviously, they did have categories like eunuch, which did not fit either of those two binary categories. And so even as we try to organize how we think about what exactly is the picture in Scripture, culturally, there was actually kind of multiple categories in a different way than sometimes when we just talk about simplistically. The other thing to say is that I really appreciated your question of what do we mean when we say the Bible? I was actually referencing, there's a book came out recently by Karen Keene where she compares the process of canonization with the process of interpretation. And she's talking about that broad picture of how did we get the text that we use for translation today? How did we get that? And how does that process help us think about ways to approach interpreting Scripture well? And so I think that there's something in that could be helpful for our conversation. But I do think in general, something you said I wanted to pick up is the statement, it is a deeply relational process. And we talked about how naming is relational and the importance of that as a part of our paper. I feel like that's something that could be even more of a hinge point for these conversations as they continue. Because I do think that's actually an important piece, not only for how the Bible and biblical theology informs the questions of taxonomy, but within taxonomy itself, the process of why people name what they name, which is deeply relational. So I'll hand that then over to Matthew for more thoughts, if you have some more, Matthew.
Yeah, we've got about 2 more minutes.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to say this conversation has been very generative, and thank you everyone for your questions and comments and careful reading of our paper. This is work that Beth and I are going to continue to do. So this isn't our final word. And in fact, the whole point of the paper was to put out a bunch of ideas and hope to spark some conversation. And what I would love to see is follow-up papers from other members of the ASA and the PSCF on issues that we've raised in our paper, because there's no way we've covered everything. We've barely scratched the surface on some really important issues. When Beth and I were doing literature searches, it was really hard to find good theological work done on Adam's naming of the animals. There just doesn't seem to be a lot out there that's in the context of the naming of the animals themselves and not just Adam looking for a helpmate. And so I think there's just a world to explore in all of this. Okay. The other thing I'd like to say is I picked up this book at a used book sale a few months back. This is one of the definitive biographies of Linnaeus. And I just want to point out the cover here. It's pretty dark, but as I sort of turn it, you'll see these figures surrounded by all these animals, right? This is a painting of the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve represented on it in the life of Linnaeus. So
can somebody put that on the chat here so we can look it up? What's the author?
Book is The Complete Naturalist.
Okay.
I'll type it in here. Yeah.
All right. That's good. Okay. Our time's expired here, but our discussion doesn't have to, and we don't have to wait for a formal paper. As we commented earlier, we now have an ongoing discussion forum, so the discussion doesn't have to stop. And Vicki posted the link a little bit ago in the chat to our new discussion forum. of diving deeper. And there's a specific link to go to this particular topic. And I'll tell you one thing I intend to post in there for a continuing discussion is the whole psychology of it all. You've got the biology and the biblical viewpoint, and I'm glad Janet was around because I think there's a whole psychological issue that I want to ask about. So I'll post that on the forum, but hope many of you can continue this discussion in the forum. So with that, Beth and Matthew, again, I want to thank you for an excellent paper. Thank you for joining us here, and we look forward to meeting you at the annual meeting, hopefully. That's it. Farewell.
Thanks so much, guys.